So immediately you're struck by the three, to avoid speculation, which remind us of the not too far away prescription of the duty to verify. But as a general matter, اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم. Not the recognition that sometimes you have to make decisions based on incomplete information. So not all dhan is anything less than certainty. So it is the type of information or type of data that makes you not absolutely sure, but the preponderance of belief is such and such. It's I think it is the case that X, Y, and Z. And Allah comes and says, warns you that there is always this risk, is that when you say, I think, I believe, and if you think and you believe and you keep it to yourself, there's no sin. But if you think and you believe and you communicate it or you act upon it, there is a risk. And the risk is that you are committing a sin. If you are acting unjustly, if in fact what you think is without foundation and what you believe is incorrect, and if the decision is indeed wrongful. So Allah says, keep in mind, there's that risk. بعض الظن إثم. But this is compounded with other norms that bond with it like a molecular structure. ولا تجسسوا. Don't spy. And tajassus here, normally when we talk in the West, in English about spying, spying is violating the intimacy of someone to extract, to find out information. So you pierce the veil of privacy. But tajassus is a broader concept in Arabic and in Islamic law and in Islamic ethics. It is not just piercing the expectation of privacy. It is not just going into the Hujurat. But tajassus includes the deliberate effort to find out information about individuals for unjust causes, and for most Islamic ethicists, or for no cause. So the gathering of information simply to satisfy your curiosity, or the gathering of information to further harm, and furthering harm could also mean damaging the reputation of, when you have no grounds to damage the reputation of someone. So if I'm gathering information to know if I should go to a certain doctor for treatment, and I want to know if this doctor is good, that's not what tajassus is. Tajassus is when you are, or I want to know if I should hire a lawyer. So I go and I'm getting information about the performance of this lawyer. Tajassus is when you are seeking to find information to you either to pursue unjust causes, like damaging the reputation of a person, or, in the opinion of most, or for the purposes of engaging in entertainment ghaybah. So you are chatting about someone just as a form of entertainment. So I guess tajassus would include what we today would call stalking, whether I mean physical stalking or cyber stalking or whatever. But it's remarkable that in the Quranic ethic, the social ethics that the Quran leaves us with, and sort of like a legacy it entrusts us with, is don't spy, don't turn into yourselves into sort of lookout eyes where a human being feels that the eyes of others upon them, keeping track of their faults. I mean, when you get to the bottom line of it, is that that is not conducive to the Quranic idea of brotherhood and sisterhood amongst you. And it's not conducive to the idea that your honor is part of my honor and your reputation is part of my reputation. That if in fact the idea is that we are always looking at, well, what are your shortcomings? What are my shortcomings? In order to constantly keep an air of competition and an air of who is better than who, it doesn't take a genius to realize, well, what does that do to the fabric of society. وَلَا يَخْتَبْ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا. Now, ghaybah, of course, is what we backbiting is, and there's a famous hadith that, I mean, it raises a lot of complicated issues, but it's often cited that if you talk about someone and that whether you say what is in fact the truth about them, but they don't, if you talk about someone negatively but what you say about them is the truth, so that's ghaybah. And if you talk about them negatively and what you're saying about them is not true, it's even worse than ghaybah. That hadith, I mean, it should be understood with qualifications. That so much depends on the purpose of the speech. So, again, if I'm talking about a doctor, and the reason I'm talking about this doctor is to make an assessment whether I should seek treatment with the doctor, that's not what the hadith is talking about. Or if I'm talking about a political candidate, and the reason I'm talking about the political candidate is to decide whether to vote for them or not vote for them, that's not what the hadith is talking about. The clearest example of classic type situation is when you are talking about someone in a way that they would deem hurtful, whether true or untrue, simply because of your loss of moral control upon yourself. So, go back to the beginning of Surah Al-Hujurat, because Surah Al-Hujurat is like a tight glove, all fitting within. We all have vanities. In the same way that you might lack self-control of proper reverence with the Prophet, you might lack self-control when you talk about the other. So if you are motivated by jealousy, then that's the improper ghaybah. If you are motivated by boredom, that's ghaybah. If you are motivated by a sense of anger, but that has no constructive purpose, you're just angry. If you are motivated by a sense of spite, but again, it has no constructive purpose. It's not that you're making a decision whether to hire someone, whether to vote for someone, whether to study with someone. You are simply vetting. Now, how does it all fit together? The worst ghaybah is that which is based on dhann. It's like gradations, so it all feeds within each other. If what is involved is dhann, speculative thinking, hearsay, information that you are actually not certain about, plus information obtained through the ethic of tajassus, plus these two things led to the act of actually backbiting someone. So all these three are involved. Most scholars say that's a kabira. Then that becomes a major sin. A kabira min al-kabair. So that's like high on the scale. Then you go into a continuum. Low on the scale is a ghaybah in which did not involve tajassus, involved something that I perhaps witnessed directly, not hearsay, but I might have witnessed directly and misunderstood or understood, and then I spoke of it, and then I regained self-control, so I censored myself. So that's usually given as an example as the sort of the other extreme on the continuum. That, okay, I made I spoke about, and it's like, okay, but Allahu A'lam, astaghfirullah, I don't want to indulge in speculation. So it's a contained incident of where self-control is involved. Now, between that and the other extreme, where you deliberately engage in, let me find out. In our day and age, I guess, I don't know much about social media, but I guess, you could go do spying on social media. And, let me get together information here and there, and then let me come up with some speculative ideas about what I think was going on, and then let me talk about this person. Then you could actually be committing a kabira, a major sin. And the more you indulge, and this is, Ghazali in his Ihya writes wonderfully about this, the more you indulge in dhann, in speculation, so if you imagine on a continuum, and the more speculative your data and your thinking, and the more tajassusi your data and your thinking, the more you engaged in spying and stalking and stuff like that, and the more purposeless your ghaybah, the more you don't have a legitimate objective, the greater the sin. Of course, Ghazali then, talks about how the Prophet, ﷺ, in his Isra, goes and he sees people in hell and they're suffering this and that and this way and that way, and then he asks why are these people suffering this way, and say these are the people who committed the kabira of ghaybah. And then Ghazali says, well, this is an example of how these people are suffering in hell because they've committed a ghaybah that involved dhann and tajassus and no self-control. And I'm very skeptical about all the ahadith that describe punishment and hellfire during the Isra. But the point remains is that there is a huge difference. The whole theme of Surah Al-Hujurat is that idea of self-control and the bond between Muslims and Muslims looking out for one another. And when ghaybah involves the act of divorcing a fellow Muslim as an other, it's the same thing with mocking. It's the same thing with deriding others, putting down others. When that Muslim becomes the other, and I have no empathy for this Muslim, and I no longer connect with this Muslim as the other, and then that becomes the license to go down a path of dhann and tajassus, the worse the sin of ghaybah. And notice what Muslim scholars wrote a great deal about. That Allah compares this to eating the flesh, the dead flesh of your brother or your sister, which, as has been pointed out by so many, if Allah wanted to give us an image of how vile the sin is, I don't think Allah could have chosen a stronger example. Because, in fact, Ghazali says something very interesting, that it says it is because Muslims are supposed to be as if one body. What Allah is actually saying is that it is as if you are actually consuming your own flesh. And can you imagine the horror of eating your own flesh? So, this is the flesh of one body. And you are, the mayta here, the killing here, is the killing of the idea of a Muslim ummah, because ghaybah involves the othering of a Muslim. And the othering of a Muslim is the beginning of the dynamic for the unraveling of the idea of a single ummah bonded together. And it is precisely the type of mechanism that leads to the loss of empathy. The Prophet ﷺ, when he's asked about this verse in particular, there are a lot of hadiths, but there are two of them that I think stand out as really worthy of reflection and learning. So, the first one, the Prophet ﷺ responds by saying, خَصْلَتَانِ لَيْسَ فَوْقَهُمَا شَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَيْرِ. There are two characteristics that they're two qualities, there are no better qualities, that like they're the epitome of goodness. الظن بالله وحسن الظن بعباد الله. حسن الظن بالله وحسن الظن بعباد الله. That you think well of Allah So you believe that Allah wants the best for you, and that Allah is in fact the most compassionate, the most merciful, who wants the best for you and knows what is best for you. And حسن الظن بعباد الله, and thinking well, so treating other human beings with the same goodwill. It does, of course, it doesn't mean that you're al-mu'min kaysun fatin. It doesn't mean that you're dumb or that you're naive or whatever, but that you don't think ill, you don't deny people, especially the way you talk about them and the way you think about reputations. You don't jump to the worst interpretation. وخصلتان ليس فوقهما شيء من الشر, and there are two characteristics that are absolutely the worst, and nothing is worse than them. سوء الظن بالله, to think ill of Allah, وسوء الظن بعباد الله, to similarly think ill of other human beings. I mean, you could have, if you wanted a real Islamic education in our schools and so on, you could have many class discussions about this one hadith. Because you could have, especially young Muslim minds, ponder and think and reflect upon what does thinking well of Allah and thinking ill of Allah entail, and what does thinking well of people and thinking ill of people entail, and the various permutations of that.